You said in the talk today that this book opened your heart in a huge way, and I was wondering if Noonday Demon, writing it because it's so much about your family and so much about you, tore your heart open in another way.
You know, writing Noonday Demon seemed to me very ambitious until I decided to write this book. Noonday Demon involved talking a lot about myself and about my family and about a small group, relatively small group of other people whom I interviewed. This book, though it contains autobiographical elements, involved getting very deep inside the lives of a vast, vast array of other people. So for Noonday Demon, there were sort of maybe 20 people with whom I had in-depth interviews about depression. And for this book, I interviewed between 300 and 400 families. So it was a completely different scale. So far as it's ripping my heart open, Noonday Demon had a kind of urgency to it that this didn't, because it reflected so immediately an experience which I had immediately had. This is about the very nature of my being and who I am. It goes much deeper. So we could perhaps say that Noonday Demon cracked the shell and this extracted the nut meat.
That's sort of astonishing to hear, given some of the topics in Noonday Demon. I mean, you deal with your mother's choice to end her life. You deal with, in a way, an attempt, whether you call it melodramatic or not, to end your own. Which of the scenes in Noonday Demon, I'm just going to talk about that a little bit before we talk more about your new book. Which of the scenes in that were the hardest to write?
Well, the hardest to write was the scene of my mother's illness and death. But I think that there the writing had a very transformative function in writing about that and in writing about the depression itself, in that it took a set of experiences which had felt hollow and sad and empty, and it transformed them into something that was of value to other people. There was a very active quality of redemption in that, and that was very urgent to me. But it was also quite localized. It was about my being depressed over 5 years. It was about my mother dying on a particular day. She'd been sick for 2 years. They were very contained experiences. It had some pondering about how those contained experiences influenced who I am, but they were still contained.
And in terms of the way your writing has shaped you as a writer, I don't know the book that precedes Noonday Demon. I know Noonday Demon, and I know the scope of what you've described this new one is. Have your mountains gotten higher each time you attempt a book?
My mountains have become steadily higher, which either reflects my wild originality or my sheer idiocy. I think that I will try in the future not to have anything that's as broad as this. It's just been an overwhelming decade putting it together, and I think I need to do things that are more manageable. But yes, essentially, I think the scope of what I'm doing is continue to open up and broaden. You know, I think we live in a time in which people think that wisdom is associated with depth of knowledge. We live in this era of specialization, and I think that wisdom is in fact really located in breadth of knowledge, at least as much as it is in depth of knowledge, and that actually narrowness is not a triumph, as it's so often posited to be. My first book was about a group of Soviet artists and how their life changed during Glasnost. My second book was a novel. My third book was the book about depression. The new book you heard about today, it's about the structure of family and all these extraordinary circumstances. And people have sometimes said, oh, you keep moving from thing to thing, but I think each of these things illuminates the others, and I think they're all really about resiliency in the face of trauma. That's what the Soviet artists encapsulated, that's what all of it is really about. So there is a running theme, but I think that theme can only be understood if you approach it from every possible angle. I don't think you can, I mean, I couldn't have just gone on writing about Russian art. That would have been, for me, a straitjacket.
Mm-hmm. And just one question to sort of tie in all that you've just said to writing for students of writing. What you're just saying about surmounting obstacles, is there an element of that for you to face the page each day?
You know, there are days when I sit down and miraculously lots of stuff seems to come, and there are days when I sit down and nothing seems to come. And for a long time I worked on the optimistic belief that if I just ignored those days, the other kind of days would show up after a while, but they don't. I mean, there is a lot of having to face the blank page and push my way through it. For me, the most difficult thing is always structure. I mean, I have sometimes said that it took me 5 years to write the table of contents for this book, and then not that long actually to write it.
Talk about the structure of the chapters themselves in the new book.
So the idea really had was to gain a great deal of knowledge about these various subjects. So if I'm writing a chapter about autism, I felt I needed to understand the genetics of autism. I needed to understand the social reality. I needed to understand what the treatments are. I needed to understand the autism activism movement. I needed to understand all of these sort of big things. I needed to be able to write fairly fluently about them. I needed most of all perhaps to understand where the science is on autism and how much we know about where it comes from and what it actually is. And then I wanted to tell the stories of these various families and how their experience reflected on those other realities. So what I did for each chapter, in effect, was that I wrote the completely non-narrative part of it, the part that was historical and technical and the book research, in effect. And I wrote all of these family stories. And then I had to take the family stories and try to figure out where they fit in, and I kept moving them around and putting them in different places and thinking, oh, but if that one goes there, then I don't really need this other one at all, and I should take out the part of that one that's about this. It was very jigsaw puzzle-like. It was difficult even to write that first part and just figure out how to get all of the understandings of these topics to align, because they aren't simple topics. I mean, if you're looking at dwarfism, you have to look at sort of what historically does, what is our understanding of deformity? What does it mean for there to be a dwarf political movement? What are the surgical procedures that people have that are supposed to correct dwarfism, and what are the issues with them? What are the ways in which the general perception of dwarfs as comical actually have an influence on the lives of actual dwarfs? And then I have to get the stories of people, and you want the stories that fit with the narrative, but you also want to be representative of the larger range of experience, and you don't want to give up amazing stories just because they don't fit very neatly somewhere. And so it's a constant negotiation. It's like an endless contract thing going back and forth between a union and a sort of corporate boss, where it's kind of, but what if we give you that and we don't do that, and how about if we did that? But it takes a long time to emerge. They're very complicated to put together. And I found that I would write a chapter and then I would go back to it a year later to look it over, and I would think, I mean, what is that thing doing at the end? That has to be in the middle, and that thing that's here, and I kept rearranging them. So it was a constant sort of reshuffle going on.
And also, I'm imagining, because in Noonday Demon you deal with the ways depression was treated in the past, and I'm just thinking about autism, all the myths about autism, about like that maybe it's caused by immunizations, that it's mothers not touching their, there's been so many things that have been assumed. Are those kinds of historical elements?
Those historical elements are part of it insofar as they illuminate the current situation. In the depression book, I really wanted to write in one chapter, which was in fact the most time-consuming chapter in the book, the history of depression. For this book, I'm not doing anything that is historical unto itself in that way. But I think that the way that people deal with autism now has a lot to do with the fact that Bruno Bettelheim said that autism was caused by cold and rejecting mothers. And so mothers have got anxieties around autism which are greater than I think they would be without that legacy. And so I have to talk about that legacy. And I have to talk to some degree about the strange phenomenon that no one had ever heard of autism 100 years ago, and now everyone seems to have autism. And how can that be? And what does it mean about the way we define illness, and what does that mean about possible environmental stimulants that may have been implicated in industrial societies, and what are all of the issues around it? So it all gets dragged in, but it gets dragged in service of illuminating what is happening right now and what is it that these families are going through, rather than simply because it's really cool and interesting to know the whole fun history, or not so fun history, as the case may be.
Is depression good for a writer? And is, what do you call it, the horizontal...
Identities.
Is a horizontal identity a good training ground for a writer?
So there's a myth, of course, that depression is the basis for a lot of great writing, and I think that really severe clinical depression, of the kind that I was primarily writing about in doing my book, is not so great for a writer or for anyone else. I think when you're that depressed, you can barely function, and that greatness does not come out of that. But I think that in the ways in which it interrupts your life, it forces you to turn introspective as you emerge from it. And so I think there can be great creativity at which you arrive as a result of the mechanisms necessary to integrate your experience of depression into your understanding of your own personality. That, I think, is the way in which depression can be inspiring to writers. But I certainly don't feel like depressions are great and you should go have one and then you'll be able to write really wonderful poetry. So, and for horizontal identities, which is this word that I've used to describe all kinds of ways for children to be different from their parents, it's difficult to generalize entirely, but I think that the more of a process you have to go through to establish your own identity and understand who you are, the more insight you'll have to rustle up, and I think that inevitably informs and strengthens writing. But again, I feel like that ultimately comes down to the sort of truism that there is meaning in suffering. There is meaning in suffering, and I think lots of good writing has come from people who have suffered, but some pretty good writing has come from people who have not suffered that much. And certainly a lot of people have suffered without producing anything you would ever want to read. So I think it depends. And I think, frankly, that suffering is readily available in the atmosphere, and I mean, I don't think of myself as a person who suffered enormously. I did have this depression, but if I hadn't had that, I would have had other things. I had the sort of issues of being gay, but I think if I hadn't been gay, I would have been something. I just think if you're a person who is open to the emotional spectrum of life, there's going to be stuff at the negative end to come in and bother you. And I think that's really what it's ultimately about, is not being where that spectrum gets stretched to the point at which it constitutes mania or depression and dysfunction, but just being open to a full emotional range gives you a good basis for writing.
Well, I thank you for all the writing that you've done and for the courage that you've transmitted in the words you've put on paper, because it really is an emotional experience to read research in some ways, to read the assimilation of it, to read the way you put things together. So thank you.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure this has been.